everybody, welcome to number 27, I'm Jack. Now I don't normally review 4x4s or cars like this, but the Land Rover is so iconically British that I just had to see what all the fuss was about. Now this is a car that was originally designed to only run for 2 to 3 years until Rover managed to get their previous production cars back online. What actually happened, ironically, is that this series of cars, the leaf spring cars like this one, ran for 35 years, spawned a whole new company that in itself outlived poor old Rover that died off in the 2000s. To explain how this happened and why it was so successful, we need to go back to 1948. After the war, the British government only allowed production of vehicles which could either help rebuilding the country's infrastructure or that could be sold for export, thus helping with finances. Now, Rover's pre-war production of luxury cars didn't really fit into those priorities, added to which production would take some time to gear up again. At this same point in time, Maurice Wilks, who was Rover's head of design, had been using an American Willys Jeep on his farm. And he came up on the idea of building a British version for a couple of years that would help fill that gap in production. In 1948, it was born. In 54, Queen Elizabeth used it on her tour of the Commonwealth. And that same year, one was gifted to Winston Churchill, who then used it to tour his estate. So cars really don't get much more British than this. And yet it's interesting to remember that the inspiration for the Land Rover actually came from a car made in the USA. Like many of the best ideas, its genius came from turning adversity into advantage. Steel was hard to source, so the body panels were made from aluminium. There was a surplus of it because it had been used to make fighter planes during the war, but it was no longer needed. So it made the car cheaper, lighter, and crucially also more resistant to rust. It had a really strong box section chassis, which was also really clever because previously most chassis had been made out of U-section, which is quite strong. But it's an intensive process industrially, and at the time when they didn't have many resources, to make box section, all they needed were 4 strips of steel that were welded together, and hey presto, you've got a good chassis. The body lines were mostly flat, and where you had curves, they were constant radius, which meant that they could be beaten into shape on a relatively simple jig. The choice of colour was dictated by a surplus of aircraft cockpit paint, so the early cars only came in various shades of green. They had power takeoff drives, known as PTOs, front and back, to power different types of machinery, making them incredibly versatile, both on the farm and in construction. So some of the things that it would have been used for is you could have water pumps, they could power a winch to pull things of certain types. I've even heard that there was an attachment so it could be used to help with sheep shearing. The very first Series 1 cars came with a 1.6 4-cylinder engine with just 50 horsepower. Soon after, there was a 2-litre version. It only had an extra couple of horsepower at 52, but presumably a wodge more torque. This 1982 car has the 2.3-litre diesel. Produces a blistering 63 horsepower. And something I just want to point out while we're here, which I love, is the previous guy who restored this made a neat little tray out of aluminium for a rag. So presumably these engines aren't super oil tight, but I love that little detail. The first cars were so basic that tops for the doors and even the roof were optional extras. It was initially classified as a commercial vehicle, which meant that it was exempt from purchase tax. The problem was, though, you could only drive it then legally up to 30 miles an hour. So that means eventually they made it a multi-purpose vehicle, which meant that you yourself had to classify whether it was commercial or whether it was also used on the road. It became the dominant 4x4 in Africa, the Middle East and Australia, with roughly 90% of the market. It's said that in the 1960s, this was the first car that over a third of the world's population had seen. And in 1974, they reached the milestone of having 1 million produced. Its talents and abilities seemed unending. It even became the British Army's official light vehicle, even though there had been a car which was specifically designed for that task. The Austin Champ had originally been picked, but then when they did trials with this, they found that it was cheaper, lighter, and just as able. It was faster, heavier, and supposedly more refined than the Willys Jeep that it was based on. Let's see what it feels like for someone who's never driven one of these before. Right, so the first thoughts are that it is incredibly noisy. Luckily this one has an overdrive, so you have to dip the clutch to put it in, which I've just done, but that does quieten things down a little bit because I was in 4th gear there at 30 and it was incredible. So at idle and stuff, this is really shaky as well, but apparently once it warms up it gets a little bit better. Now, you're in an incredibly upright position, and I struggle a little bit with this one. This was a cab-only design originally, didn't have this whole back bit. And so it has a sort of a cross member here. We're not sure if in normal cars there's a bit more room at the front, but I can't go far back enough because the seats here are hitting that cross member. So for me, it's a very difficult driving position. I wouldn't be able to maintain it long term. You've got this huge steering wheel. Obviously the steering is non-assisted and it's almost phenomenally vague. I mean, you turn the wheel and it seems like initially not very much happens. I normally get here and I do a pull through the gears and well, let's humour it anyway. We'll go back into take off the overdrive. We haven't spoken about low range or anything yet, but anyway, put it into first, and then we'll unleash the 60 horsepower. You kind of have to juggle a little bit with the overdrive as you're changing up and down. It does make a lot of sense having it in this, I think. One of the things that Dario says that he likes about this car, Dario's the owner, is that you kind of have to drive it flat out all the time, and that's something that you can't really do on modern cars. I'm doing 40 miles an hour here, and I have to say, wow, with the overdrive, it still feels pretty excruciating. I asked Dario, he drove an hour and a half to get here today, how it was for him. Wasn't it difficult? Didn't it bother him? And he said, no, it was fine. Well, it wouldn't be for me. We're now at 50. I wouldn't want to go any quicker than this. It's already just feels like it's really labouring the engine. So one of the things that's always really baffled me about these is I understand what they're about. I like them because of their purpose. They are really good at what they are designed to do. But they're not good cars on the road, as I'm proving right now. And yet, owners adore them even if they're not using them off-road. The current owner of this, he hasn't taken it off-road, and he still really, really likes it. Now, why is that they inspire such fanaticism, even in people who don't use them for what they're supposed to, and use them somewhere where I personally am finding it quite painful? I'll confess that I can see the appeal to a certain degree. For me, the main problem here is simply that it is too noisy, very, very slow. It doesn't feel like a real car. It feels like something out of a different world. It is a bit of a cross between a tractor and a car in essence, and that's how it was designed. It's so agricultural in nature, from that steering to the vibrations coming through from the engine onto your hands, to the incredible slowness, the imprecision of the steering. It almost becomes fun because of how terrible it is on the road. By any sort of normal measurements, you would say it's awful, but I don't know. You sit high up, you're piloting it, and God, it is terrible to steer. Sometimes in the corners, when you're tipping it in, it doesn't want to turn in that much, then it starts to move, and then surprises you again by practically understeering a little bit more just to finish off the corner. The suspension is stiff, but I don't find it particularly uncomfortable. It bucks you about and moves you, but it's okay. You're not going that fast. The main limitation for me is simply just how short that gearing is, and the fact that it is a little bit underpowered. As a Series 3, this has several luxuries that you wouldn't find in the earlier cars. So for a start, it has a dashboard. The Series 1 and 2 had the instruments in the middle as a pinnacle. There was no dashboard to speak of. This also has fabric seats. There's a little bit of carpeting or something there on the transmission tunnel. So essentially the cars didn't change that much over the years, but they did continue to evolve. The main thing where this is a big step forward for me, instead of a Series 2, is that it has all synchro mesh gears. Now, overdrive can be used in fourth and in third, but not in first or second, because apparently it can't handle the torque. So I've got to be mindful of that. I think it's going to struggle. Oh, something fell off. I think it's just a jack there. Okay. The gearbox is a little bit vague, but actually pretty easy to use. You have to push it all the way to the left to get reverse. It hits a natural little barrier for first gear, and then it snaps into gear quite nicely. And underneath here you have the four-wheel drive selector, which is the red gear. Then the low range is there. You push that down and that automatically, don't want to do that, selects four-wheel drive as well. And then of course the override, which I already mentioned. The override really is useful. I think without it, I would find it very, very hard to live with this car. Well, brakes are frightening, even by the standards of the low speeds, but once you get into the swing of it, the secret is don't judge it or measure it by the standards of anything else that you have ever driven. If you start to just compare it, then it all falls apart. But if you keep in mind that it's just a completely different vehicle, you start to get into sync with it. Now, of what I would call the original Land Rover, which was this, so the leaf spring cars, there was 3 series. They were made from 48 to 1985. So that's a 37-year run for a car which was supposed to last 2 years, and instead ended up building a whole different separate company that outlived the original. Anyway, of those there are 3 series. The Series 1s are the most sort of in demand, they're the ones that are worth the most money. Then there's Series 2s and Series 3 like this. There haven't been huge changes between them. Series 1 cars had the headlights in the middle, behind the grille, slightly more angular bodywork, I believe. Mainly the interior has changed in this, so this has a dashboard that the other cars didn't have. And quite importantly, it has synchro on all the gears. So Series 3, the most easy to live with. Series 1 is in the most demand. I think you'd be paying something starting at 5,000 for a project up to maybe 40,000 depending on condition and which year, so Series 1, 2 or 3 you're looking at. If I had one, I have to say that I think I would want to try and do some off-roading with it, because that's really where they excel. Although it's also the simplicity of the engineering which makes it an appealing thing for me. If you have to do work on it, there's just so little to it. You can look underneath, you can get underneath without having a jack. It all makes life pretty simple. The diesel cars like this one may be slow, but Dario manages to get 25, 27 miles to the gallon out of it, and I know that the petrol cars will be far less efficient. Right, so what to make of this American-inspired British icon? Well, to drive on the road, if you're someone who's used to modern cars or even sportier cars, well, you'd find it dreadful. It is rattly, it is incredibly noisy, it's pretty uncomfortable. Certainly in this version, I haven't got enough space for my legs. But I have to confess, although I am one of those people, I do have a soft spot for this. I think it is just the honesty of the design, the fact that it was designed to do one thing, and although it doesn't drive nicely in a traditional manner, there's something quite addictive about the way that it does drive. Your upright position, the fact that it is so agricultural, you know, it has its own, I don't know, it kind of worms its way into you a little bit. Thank you so much to all of you for watching. Thank you to Dario for bringing it down today, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.